Hi. Thank you for being here, everybody. This is a really, really big honor for me to be doing this workshop at SchneidersLaden, which is a store that I've always been looking at for many years, but didn't know what to do at the place, I guess, because I'm actually I came very late to the world of modular synthesis. Just a little bit about me and what I do is, my name is Aditya. I am from Bombay, India, and I originally come from the world of guitar and guitar pedals, so modular and modular synthesis happened much, much later. I think it's just as recent as a couple of years ago that I actually really started looking into modular synths as hardware and not just as pure data or Max or Reactor plugins then. I started Animal Factory because I had been building pedals for many years, but I was just doing it as a hobby for some time, and I did these really shitty designs because it was just flimsy. It was you can't really get good materials to build stuff in India. So it was only around 2008 or 2009 that I started importing things like switches and jacks and knobs and pots, and started developing a more professional approach to building stuff. And word got around that I was doing this, and nobody was doing this at the time in Bombay. I think there were a couple of manufacturers that did really bad copies of distortion pedals. They took the DS1s and small stone circuits and just repackaged them in folded metal boxes, and it was disastrously bad because the switches didn't exist or they broke and they had unusable noise. And I wanted a sound. And here's the thing about, I think something that actually worked really well in my favor is that I never had access to a lot of things growing up because we didn't have a lot of pedals in India. We didn't have a lot of synths in India. So what we could get access to was schematics. So I only saw the electronic circuits, and I learned how to build electronic circuits, but I never knew what an original tone bender sounded like, or what an original Big Muff sounded like. And because I didn't know, I didn't care. I just built something that I thought sounded good, and when I started doing Animal Factory, it was a conscious decision to build things that don't sound like other things. So even when I'm building things like the Pit Viper, which is based on the Marshall Bluesbreaker, it doesn't sound anything like the original circuit because it's just been modified so much. Even my very first pedal, which is the Super Fuzz FY6, it's not a clone, but it's very close to the circuit. I modified it enough to say, okay, let's not do some vintage garbage. Let's make it usable in new ways. And let's make it more modern sounding, more aggressive sounding. Because I think that's where I come from musically. I grew up listening to a lot of synth pop as well, don't get me wrong. I have a younger sister, I listen to Backstreet Boys under protest. But my roots were, funnily enough, at a time where everybody was listening to a lot of pop. I was part of that reject group in the school that listened to a lot of Megadeth and Metallica, and we were making tapes for each other. And but then I branched off into my own weird space by listening to a lot of industrial suddenly, and so Nine Inch Nails and Einstürzende Neubauten, some Coil, Throbbing Gristle, that stuff. So that's when. And that's why I do distortion, because it creates textures that you can't really get from the normal usage of instruments. And that is something that's always motivated me sonically and musically. I have these things set up in this way, but I'm going to tell you the story in a more chronological manner and go into each of these in the order that they appeared, I guess. It started with this one, so this is where kind of the Animal Factory story started. I can't really zoom in without shifting the camera, so I'm not going to do that right now. This is a pedal called the Chemical Burn, and like I said, I was very much into really noisy rock and also some fuzz and fuzz-tainted sounds. Like if you listen to early Smashing Pumpkins, Billy Corgan's got this really aggressive sound, which is not just the Big Muff, but the Big Muff and the Super Fuzz FY6. And you can also listen to Live at Leeds by The Who, and I think Pete Townsend is just going crazy on this pedal. And I wanted something that went in that direction, but just was even nastier. Because it was just, I don't know, I wanted that big, raw fuzz sound that you just couldn't get with a Big Muff. And don't get me wrong, I really like the Big Muff circuit. I've built a lot of them, but it just doesn't do it for me when it comes to texture. I'm gonna turn this one down and bring it back up a bit. I'm gonna be using primarily drum machines. I'm going to be using primarily drum machines in my demonstration because I was going to get a guitar, but I said, okay, let's not do that because there are people and there are nice people and they really don't need to, they don't deserve it. It's something that it's an ordeal that not everybody should go through. My lovely girlfriend is sitting in the room and she has not had to suffer me playing guitar yet. This is, a quick introduction. This is a digital drum synthesizer. It's called the LXR. It is made by a man called Julian Schmidt, Sonic Potions. I built it myself. It's fantastic because I can really deep dive and modify things. I'm using the dance mouse to demonstrate mostly the bass and the kick-oriented sounds on this because it sounds I can't get this one. Maybe I'm not doing it correctly, but I can't get the depth and the power that I get from the kicks here. I have a simple loop running over here. And I'm just going to demonstrate really quickly what the chemical burn sounds like. The chemical burn is a little softer than a lot of the other pedals that I have created because it's still a lot closer to the vintage circuit. You have to keep in mind a lot of this stuff was designed primarily for guitar, and this being my first pedal ever, it was really designed with guitar in mind. It just sounds a lot better it makes a lot of things sound a lot better. And it's got a primarily, so this is the pedal with minimum distortion. It has an octave up switch, which you can't really hear as well on the drums as you will when I play this. Hang on, let me just zoom out. I'm going to be playing it with the Roland TB3. Yeah. I'm also using really basic gear because I don't want to use anything with a very characteristic sound or something that sounds amazing on its own. I'd like to use things that sound good, but don't have that iconic status yet because A, I don't have them, I can't afford them, and I'd like to show you what the flavors of the pedals actually are. So this is just the volume knob. You're listening to the pedal on minimum distortion. And this is something that I really like when I'm working with fuzz because you can do this digitally to some extent, but there's some, I don't know, I think there's some irreplaceable character to the way things saturate that actually makes you work with in a more involved way with hardware. I can scoop out the mids this way and flatten them here. I can also raise the clipping threshold using this switch, using this potentiometer, so that it distorts at earlier or later. Now I've lifted the octave so that you get more of the fundamental signal inside, and not so much of the upper and lower harmonics, which is what's happening here. But to better illustrate that, I'm going to show to you what it sounds like using basic acid baseline. Let me just turn the volume down over here. Sweeping out the mids over here, putting them back, adding, and yeah, just setting the clipping threshold to different levels. This is where you actually hear it the most, that you just have the fundamental, like the middle of the signal is just out, so all you're hearing is the upper and the lower harmonics to the greatest extent. This is after being distorted. And I think the reason I've built much cooler pedals after that. I've built pedals that were much cooler, but I think this is still the one that remains on my board all the time, whether I'm playing guitar or bass, because one, it's special to me, because I just started out doing these things, and I was a complete fanboy and still am of a really famous. Does anybody know the guitar player David Thorne? He has an industrial project called Splatter Cell as well. David Thorne is an amazing jazz guitar player who made his name in the 80s as a looping, like a live looping master. And he's also he concentrates mostly on film work now, so he's done a lot of A-list Hollywood movies. Worked a lot with Bill Bruford and Tony Levin from King Crimson, who are just also like one of my favorite bands. And I just randomly, and that's the power of the internet, I just randomly wrote to him on the internet and I said, hey, I'm a big fan, I have a pedal that I just made, and could you check it out? And I sent him one of these, and 2 weeks later he just sends me a demo and says, it's great, it's massive, it's superb, it does all these things. And that's what really kickstarted Animal Factory for me. And for me personally, I felt like I was 14 years old again, because I'm just like, wow, I have, my third favorite guitar player of all time, like more even so than Jimi Hendrix, is using my things and saying amazing things about them. And yeah, and that kind of kicked off the development of things. And now that I had the crazy part set up, and what I kind of do is I mostly design things for myself. It's never the process. At least early on, I didn't take on a product-driven approach, because I just I made a few pedals and sold a few pedals, and I said I want to build things that sound good to myself. I want to build things that have their own character. And what I kind of needed at that point was a really simple overdrive pedal, and I would never imagine that it would go to that lengths that it did, because since then people have been using it in their studios, they've been using it live. Some of my favorite artists of all time and producers are using it on everything from guitars to synthesizers to vocals even. And I'm just gonna add a second cable over here. Actually, I'm going to demonstrate this one for you using the Tons mouse, because I'd like to show you that how exactly it works with low and high signals. So just a short word to. Oops, that was too fast. We're looking at the pedal over here. That's the Pit Viper. The Pit Viper, it was designed actually as a dual overdrive, because I like to layer distortion and create more complex textures with that. It has 3 controls. It's really simple. This is a gain knob. This is a tone knob, which also kind of acts as a volume knob because it takes away so much of the highs and middles of the signal. And this is a volume knob. Interesting fact is, because of the architecture, I've used a rail-to-rail op-amp, which means that the voltage, are we all tech savvy here? I think we are, right? Or should I get into voltages and stuff like that, impedances? It uses a very high impedance at the input, and the voltage levels can swing up to 8 volts, or about 1 volt less than the maximum power supplied. Which means that if you're giving it 9 volts, which is the standard pedal power, you get up to 8 volts at the output. And right now, I think it can take up to 0.5 to 1 volt of input signal without distorting at all. And that would sound something like this as a clean boost setting. I'm going to turn the volume down and adjust it because this one gets really loud as well. These 2 switches out here are clipping switches. Like I said, for me, I don't have any idols. I don't care about Marshall or Fender or Electro-Harmonics or whatever it is, because for me it was more about, let's get your sound in. Let's make something that's so complex and moving that that you can't really replicate it with anything else. So right now it's just working as a clean boost, and this is about the point that you can hear that it starts to distort. What I really like to do with something like this is use it on hi-hats, claps and snares to add a little bit of a rush, but also just, work the transient a little bit. And this one does it in a very different way. There is a low cut on this, so you're not going to hear much of the bass, but it will tighten up the subs when I turn the decay up. That's what it sounds like otherwise. And it's already started distorting because I have turned up the master volume too much. And if I want to preserve dynamic range, I usually work with gain in very specific ways. So if I just turn it up, you have a nice punch to the kick. But what I find more interesting is doing something like this, where I turn up the gain internally. I'm not overloading the first stage. I keep the first stage pleasant, and then take the maximum of the saturation and push it to the second part. And I can get a clip in different ways as well. Because I've turned on the gain or the output on the drum machine so far, it's gonna be a little more subtle, but I'll make it a little more apparent after the first part. So this is the clipping switches off. One of the coolest things about this thing, and this is really weird because this was my least favorite pedal. I really liked it, but I thought, it's kind of normal, it's kind of vanilla, I don't really care so much for it. And then I met one of my, I don't know, I think normal people, like you guys watched football, or I don't know. No, I don't think there's any normal people in this room, are there? No? Okay. Yeah, it was kind of weird because I grew up in the 90s. Like I was born in '81, and we didn't have internet access till '95. yeah, 95, yeah, 96, 97. I had 28.8 kbps modems. Does anybody remember those?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so I mean, it was weird because all the other guys at that age, and you got to remember that we're 18 or 19-year-old geeky dudes who kind of start sweating when they start talking to women. The other guys were downloading everything from Playboy centerfolds very slowly, and something that I didn't know existed till very recently, ASCII porn. It was a thing, so you actually saw naked people in ASCII format that you could print on a dot matrix printer. I was downloading schematics. I was glossing or stuff like this, and then I was just like really into my industrial music at that point and my alternative rock. And the name Flood and Alan Moulder kept on popping up in album liners. And all my favorite albums at that time were made by Flood and Alan Moulder. So one day, 3 years ago, Flood just shows up in New Delhi. And a friend of mine says, hey, get yourself a ticket, get on the plane. He's a really hard person to get a hold of, but he's going to be here for 3 days, and you can spend some time with him, and you can show him your stuff. And, you know, if it's nothing, it's kind of like going to Candyland and, you know, just hanging out with Mickey Mouse or whatever. And I did. And he did a workshop, which he was not prepared for, because nobody told him he was doing a workshop. Thank you for telling me I'm doing a workshop. And I got him some pedals to try out. And he tries out this one, and he suddenly, like, his eyes are this big, and he says, this is amazing. And I say, what, that one, really? And you like that one? He says, yes. You made a really bad guitar and a really bad amplifier sound amazing with this. And the guy who owned the guitar and amplifier was not happy at all about that comment. I mean, like, it was, he said, I said, okay, you know what, you can take it back to the studio. And he was a great guy because he said, I'm not taking it back for free, you have to invoice me. And the next day, as soon as he got back from London, he's like, Alan tried it out, he wants 3 of them. He wants one for Trent Reznor and one for St. Vincent and one for himself. And again, I'm 14 or 12 years ago, 14 years old again, and just wondering, you know, how is all of this happening? And then he bought 2 more after that, and then Fink wanted one, and it was just, I don't know, it's not really that easy I think it's not really easy to transfer the cultural context, because we, growing up in India, we never had the opportunity to meet these people or see concerts or something. We had this one concert every year where you had a guy, we had like really bad cover bands playing covers of Metallica, Iron Maiden, Pearl Jam, Nirvana. And I remember sometimes they just couldn't do the job, so you had like people covering Metallica's One, and either they didn't have a double bass or they didn't know how to use, they weren't skilled enough to use the pedal. So sometimes they played double bass on the low toms, and it was awful. But you know, that's all we had. We just had that. So all of this happening was just crazy for me. So I'm just gonna turn up the drive on this a bit. And what I think is really cool is that I found out from his recording engineer at the studio that he likes to use this on a parallel processing bus. So he lets everything, like he lets the entire mix go there, sometimes warms it up or does just a vocal. And then after I started playing with it, I started realizing why. It's because I think maybe it's the low cut, maybe it's the high headroom inside the circuit, but it has a lot of clarity. And if you listen closely, you will actually hear that the pedal doesn't overload with the lows. It kind of sidechains on the highs. And it can get really glassy. I mean, if you turn up the tone, and I play slide blues very badly. but I tend to use a brass slide, and I like to get those overtones. I need to roll back on this a bit. But when I'm using a complex source like a drum machine, I don't have the mud which is something that I hate about distortion. When I tell people, like, when you're using distortion, be careful with how you're shaping your tonal areas, because frequencies can get really clustered, and that's not good for anybody. It's not good for the recording engineer. It's not good for the audience, because it's a big PA is going to translate that into absolute mush. I mean, it's just going to sound like more shit, and I think if there's anything that you should be doing for the world, it's not creating more shit. So that's the story of the Pit Viper. Now that we've got the emotional, well, not completely, we have some of the emotional stuff taken care of. I said, okay, that's all great, but I want to have some fun as well. And that's when I came up with this fun guy. This is called the Baron Samedi. And the Baron Samedi actually started out because I wanted to use the Baron Samedi artwork on a pedal. I mean, as stupid as that sounds, I just really wanted to do a pedal as Baron Samedi, which has a lot in common with Gore Eater, because I wanted to build a pedal that can do justice to the painting by Francisco Goya, which is Saturn devouring his son. I'll zoom in a little more so you can see that, but right now the Baron Samedi is the one that came next. The Baron Samedi was, does anybody know that old 70s song Spirit in the Sky? Am I the only person who cares? No, yeah.
Can you sing it? Can you sing it? Yes.
I don't. I think the Geneva Convention doesn't allow me to do this. It's got this really, it's got this really weird opening. It sounds like a bit of it's like an organ, but it's actually a guitar. No? Okay. No. Doesn't matter. Like I said, I shouldn't sing. I'm tone deaf. There's a reason I built this stuff and don't play it. I mean, I picked my path. I don't shit where I eat. I actually find the Baron more fun with this one, but I'll do it with both. The Baron was, for me, it was something where I just said because I want to celebrate everything I love about fuzz in one pedal, and I don't always like the oscillated fuzz. I like the more gated fuzz textures, and for me that is a bit like, so we have this running over here. If I just turn everything, well, specifically these two, I'm going to explain the controls to you. This is voodoo. This is rum. These are life, death, and burial. Any questions? This is the volume knob. So far, it sounds like a pretty standard distortion unit. But it can get really, really weird because it does these things. So this is the gain control, this one here. This is a tone control, but it's a really strange tone control. There's a story about this tone control. The schematic is up on the internet, by the way, so if you ever want to build one yourself, it's pretty easy. Go ahead. You have my blessings. The tone control was designed because the first iteration of the Baron pedal had 4 knobs. The box that I had etched by hand for the Baron Samedi pedal had 4 holes for potentiometers, but I only had 3 knobs. So I said I need to add a function somewhere, and I came up with this really weird tone control that sweeps from low pass to low pass with a really deep notch in the middle, so you can actually sweep to some weird frequencies. So that existed, the volume and gain existed obviously, but it was the addition of this control where I said this is now complete. I am happy. I'm not changing the circuit for the foreseeable future. I might, like I said, I don't have idols, nothing is holy, so you never know. It might just change, but the idea is that you can do things like this. I actually said before that I didn't like self-oscillating fuzzers, I didn't like oscillating fuzzers in the high range. Completely, well, I didn't discover the function, and I didn't put it there purposely, it just happened. And it turns out that this thing also in a very particular setting, which is very controllable, so you can go back to it if you ever want it. You could just go back to it. It doesn't even depend on the input that you're getting from the drum machine. It does this. Let's give it a little level. What's actually really interesting is I was in Prague last week with the guys from Bastel Instruments, and somebody came up to me and he said, "Can you just set that pedal so that it can start self-oscillating?" I said, "Yeah, sure." And we went around here. And he said, give it a little bit of a signal of any sort. So right now, I'm just giving it this click from the kick drum, just the attack. And yeah, I kind of have this weird, like, I don't know, this is the cool part about doing what I do, is because people teach you how to use your stuff in ways that you didn't know about. And I didn't know I had a kick drum and a pedal until somebody told me, try this out, it might work. And it does. So just a quick explanation of what's happening here. I will not just leave you with life, death, and burial, because that's very morbid. Life, death, and burial are three very interactive knobs that control respectively the tone control. This is a gate control that is almost like a pulse width modulation effect, because you're taking the square wave, it's almost like the fuzz is almost clipping it into a square wave, and then you're reducing it to just the positive spikes.
It's the fuzz width, no?
Almost, yeah. You're just thinning out the sound so much that it also works as a bass cut, which can be quite useful. So whenever I'm playing my live sets and I have a drum loop, I always have two drum machines because my sound comes from the drums. This guy replaces the DJ's high-pass filter trick, because I can just use this and then move back in there. If I want a little more dynamic range, I just roll the gain control back a bit. And this is kind of a nice normal fuzz. Lastly, the burial control is kind of interesting, and I don't know how to demonstrate it effectively over here. Let me try it with this, maybe. Okay, so that's your undistorted sound. and I'm going to turn the distortion a little up, turn the volume up a bit. The burial control is a subharmonic control. What it's actually doing is it's voltage starring the circuit, and in some way this affects both the input impedance. So the first stage kind of starts pushing only the low transients through. I haven't, honestly, like this was built at a time when I didn't have the knowledge, enough knowledge to understand what I was doing completely. Especially because the circuit itself is so weird. It's based off the Jordan Boss tone, but I modified it in ways that made it completely, I don't know, different, I guess. You can kind of hear it now. Are you hearing the low frequency artifact that's underlying the sound right And on guitar, which I will not play for your well-being, because we don't have one here. Good thing, all worked out.
I can bring you one in 5 minutes.
No. the Geneva Convention.
Everyone can play power chords.
Everyone can play power chords, yeah. I do that sometimes, properly. So it's really interesting on guitar because that's when it reacts to signals that it was designed for in the right way. So when you actually turn up this control, you can actually hear this really weird sub-bass line almost that's underlying it. And it made my guitar so synthy that I said, yeah, this is exactly why I started doing this shit in the first place. I wanted my guitar to sound like anything but a guitar. And that's what moved me forward. And last but definitely not least, I think part 4 of Emotional Story is the Gore Eater, which actually was one of the first pedals that I prototyped, but only came into fruition. I was only happy with it many years later because it had a weird behavior in. Okay, enough. It had a weird behavior in the subs that I didn't like. A little bit about this guy is I had designed this pedal with a very specific purpose. So this one actually had a very clear end in mind. And I'd say this is the one that was designed with the most specific design principles. I don't know if anybody plays bass guitar here or has bought bass fuzz pedals. But the one thing about bass fuzz pedals that I've always hated is that they get rid of the low end. And you always have to dial the clean back to make the low end work. I wanted a very specific outcome from this pedal, namely, I wanted something that distorts so heavily in the low that you don't need to bring back this. I do like, but I don't use clean sounds very often. And when I was playing in a very short-lived band, which was called Domes, we will come back. Yes, it was because the drummer was also bald, and I had to fill up the sound. And I needed to run 2 signal parts, one completely clean and one always dirty, into 2 separate amplifiers. And I always found that the chemical burn was great, but if I wanted a more subtle distortion that wasn't completely fuzzed out, then I needed something that would give me that low end without losing the clean. And that's when this guy came in. And I also, again, I had no idea where this pedal would end up going because it just went to people that I really, really admire. And was anybody at Superbooth at the Gesprächskonzert with Alexander Hacke from... Okay, then I'll go back to that in a roundabout story, but I'll first explain the pedal to you. It looks very complicated, but it's not. Gore Eater, I don't know, maybe people are familiar with the story. Gore Eater was, sorry, I'm losing my voice. I'm just going to take a quick. The story of Gore Eater and the story of the painting is before in Greek mythology, before the gods came about, you had, before the Olympians came about, rather, you had the Titans. And one of the Titans' name was Kronos, or in Roman mythology was Saturn. And Saturn was terrified by a prophecy that said that his children would overthrow him. So every time he had a child, he would devour the child. And finally, his wife Rhea hid the last one, Zeus, from him and gave him a rock to eat. And the crazed Saturn just ate the rock, and Zeus grew up, and Zeus obviously fulfilled the prophecy by slitting open the Titan's stomach, and that's how the 6 gods who became the Olympians came to the world as Greek mythology knows them. I wanted a pedal that sounded so big it could eat gods. That's kind of where the motivation came from. And I really like using the dance mouse to demonstrate this because, like I said, the power is in the kick. This is the pre-gain control. So these 2 knobs comprise the pre-gain section. This is the pre-gain, and this is a low cut. So what it effectively does is it kind of cleans up the low end if you don't want that much sub power going in there, because there is a lot of saturation in the low end in the stages that follow. And what I'm trying to do over there with this knob is reduce, is anybody familiar with the concept of blocking distortion? In gain staging, when you have multiple gain stages, blocking distortion is what occurs when you have very low frequency, high energy signals that overload the next stage. So if you ever hear, say, a kick drum that is mushing out your channel, then it's probably because you have too many sub-frequencies going into a preamp that was not designed to handle them. So it's either a problem of headroom or it's a problem of like too much energy in the subs. But it's basically when low energy causes the next stage to essentially distort and slow down. And it's a weird concept because you have to think of it in terms of energy and not so much in terms of voltage physics, I guess. I don't know, although it's kind of the same thing, but that's what it is. And you can actually control the amount of blocking distortion that is occurring by overloading the subs, by turning this down, or cutting the subs, which will tighten up the sound a little bit. This is the gain control. So these 2 together really help you mold how much saturation and crunch and grunt you want. This is the tone control. It is basically a big muff tone control with one modification. You can dial in the sub bass, or you can adjust the width of the notch, basically. So if you turn it up all the way into the treble area, but you still want your bass back, that's how you do it. So the signal path kind of goes this way, and then this way. And that's the volume control. These 2 are clipping switches, and I think it's best that I demonstrate these when I actually turn the pedal on, which is now. I'm going to turn the decay down on the kick, just to give you an idea of how low it can go. So right now, we still have the decay over there somewhere. And no gain. That's maximum gain though. I did tell you about the low cut function, which is currently set to maximum, so you can actually hear the blocking distortion now. and actually hear the side chaining happening with the kicks as opposed to the pit viper, where the side chaining was happening on the hi-hats and the claps. Do you hear that little bass line thing that's happening? That's actually the attack from the hi-hat. So, I mean, that should give you an idea of what the bass reserves of this pedal are. Then you've got 3 more switches and you're probably wondering what they do. Like I said, I like control over clipping. I like to make things sound differently in different frequency ranges. And the one thing that I always play with is diode combinations in clipping sections. And this is no exception. So right now the clipping is off because both the switches, this controls the first stage, this one controls the second stage. And it can get really compressed. Like this one as well. But then I came up with the idea of LED clipping, and I said, you know, why aren't we using technologies that are modern? Because why do pedal builders really care about germanium and stuff that hasn't been used in 30 years in conventional electronics to create mojo and vintage garbage that they can market and sell for $10 more or $20 more? So Animal Factory is it runs on a no bullshit principle. So I don't sell you vintage mojo with $20 capacitors and tell you that you're going to sound like John Mayer tomorrow. That's not my ambition at all. If you're looking to sound like John Mayer, you need to, I don't know, I guess you got to be John Mayer or something. But what I did was I tried to use 2 red, green, blue LEDs and construct them in such a way that they work differently with different frequency bands. And you can see that here. The light is a little... Is there any way to turn up the intensity of the light? Okay, there we go. You can just about see it now. Here's the interesting thing about if you ever decide to build your own distortions, play with LEDs. Play as much as you can with LEDs because LEDs are really interesting clipping devices. Different LEDs, different colors distort at different levels, which means that a red LED will clip really fast, a green will clip slower and have a more interesting granular sound to it, and a blue has a lot more, I don't know, I kind of describe it as sandpaper because there's a lot of space. It will distort very late, but it has a lot of roughness. Same with white. It's kind of weird because people are talking about cool, kids are trading pornography, and I'm telling people how LEDs sound. I don't know. I was a weird child, I guess. Yeah, you can actually see that the different frequency ranges are causing this thing to distort differently. It's very hard to capture it because of the way it's lit up, but you have a lot of green LED action happening right now. That is closing right now. Add more texture this way. just use it as a saturator. And that's what I kind of miss when I play with distortion. That other people. I mean, I don't like to go down specific manufacturers. I love distortion, and there's always like something to be found from different pedals. And one thing I kind of had a problem with always was that they just didn't have that much bandwidth, I guess. And that's something I try to maintain with my pedals is keep the bass, keep the treble, cut out your information in the mix or at the amplifier, because information is great. More information is always good. And by getting rid of it permanently in destructive ways within the pedal itself is kind of defeating the purpose of exploring sound, which is where that's something I kind of firmly believe in. Oh yeah, emotional storytelling. So I was 14 years old again last week because one of my biggest influences, Mr. Alexander Hacke from Einstürzende Neubauten. Does anybody know? Everybody knows Einstürzende Neubauten. Okay, great. Yeah, I gave you some really obscure references earlier, but everybody knows Einstürzende Neubauten. They were a really big influence for me because it showed me a side of industrial that I didn't know. Like I said, India, growing up, we go backwards. I find 9-inch nails, and then I go to ministry. I find ministry, and I go to coil. I find coil, I go to throbbing gristle. I go to throbbing gristle, and then I see everything around that, and one of them that obviously comes up is Einstürzende Neubauten. And I hear Einstürzende Neubauten, mind explodes because I didn't know that industrial could be so beautiful as well. I mean, that you had like, I know albums like Halber Mensch, Collapse, Tabula Rasa, stuff like that. And I didn't speak German at that time, but once I started speaking German, I was like, this guy is so weird because his lyrics are, and whenever you visit it again, then it blows your mind because it's not easy to get a lot of things. You don't pick up on a lot of things until you have a very advanced knowledge of the language and culture. But it was the sound and the approach, because I read their interviews and they said, we didn't have drums and we couldn't afford to buy drums, so we would go down to the Home Depot, to the Baumarkt, and buy plastic piping and start drumming on that, or you get a steel plate from a construction site and just mic that up. That is pretty crazy, because in Bombay everybody is really fixated. Talk to them about synthesizers. Yes, I need to really buy a Moog because I want to sound like Stefan Watson. It's like you've got this fixed idea of things, and Einstürzende Neubauten was exactly the opposite. It was just like, take what you have, make music with it. And when I met Alexander Hacke for the first time in the last Super Booth, he tried out the pedal, and he really liked it. And he said, we got to do something about this one. And he said, let's make a video. And this Super Booth, he said, hey, instead of making the video, how about we just do a live demonstration at your stand? I said, that's great, and I'd better check if everybody's going to be okay with the volume. And one thing led to another. Thanks to Andreas and SchneidersLaden and Alex Four and Super Booth, we managed to do a really nice Gesprächskonzert, which had me demonstrating the pedal with Alexander playing it. And of course, I showed up a little late because Indian standard time is always a little afterwards. She reminded me 15 minutes. I was still at my stand talking to people, and she said, you have to go. I didn't have the time to be nervous, but I was 15 years old again. It was really cool. I mean, I'm like, wow, is this actually happening right now? And there's a recording of it. It's actually now become the official demo of this pedal. He's playing it on bass guitar, and he's playing it on a baritone, on a short scale 6-string bass, and it sounds ridiculous. I mean, it was just a very surreal experience. for giving me this much time to show you all my things, all my toys.
How to have it. Thanks for